The mountain man with shoulders like hewn oak watched from the shadow of the trading post as the woman in the faded calico dress knelt beside the beggar child, pressing what looked like her only piece of bread into those small, dirt-streaked hands. Decker Thornton had seen plenty in his 32 years traversing the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Virginia wilderness, but something about this particular act of kindness struck him like a physical blow to the chest. The woman herself looked half-starved, her dress hanging loose on a frame that had clearly known better days, yet she smiled at that child with such warmth that Decker felt something long frozen in his heart begin to crack. It was late autumn in 1872, and Williamsburg, Virginia, had seen better days. The war had ended 7 years prior, but its scars remained visible in the faded storefronts and the weary faces of those who walked the dusty streets. Decker had come down from his cabin in the mountains to trade pelts and restock supplies before winter locked him away in the high country for months. He had been loading his pack mule when he caught sight of her. The woman stood slowly, brushing dust from her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. Decker noticed she swayed on her feet and his jaw tightened. She had just given away her last meal, he was certain of it. The child scampered off clutching the bread like treasure, and the woman turned toward the church at the end of the street, her steps measured and careful, like someone conserving what little strength remained. Decker found his feet moving before his mind caught up with the decision. He crossed the rutted street in long strides, his buckskin-clad form drawing curious glances from the townsfolk, who knew him only as the silent trapper who came down from the mountains a few times a year. His dark hair, longer than was fashionable and tied back with a leather cord, brushed his broad shoulders. The buckskin shirt he wore stretched tight across his muscular chest and arms, testament to years of hard living in the wilderness. "Madam," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. He spent months at a time with no company but the wind and the wolves. She turned, and Decker got his first clear look at her face. She was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 24 or 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes the color of creek water in summer. Those eyes held a wariness born of hard experience, but also a stubborn dignity that made her lift her chin despite her obvious poverty. "Yes." Her voice was soft but steady. Decker realized he had not planned what to say. He stood there, this mountain of a man rendered temporarily speechless by a slip of a woman who probably did not even reach his shoulder. "I saw what you did," he finally managed. "For the child." Her expression shuddered immediately, pride stiffening her spine. "I am not looking for praise or charity, sir. Did not figure you were." Decker shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the attention their conversation was drawing. "But I have more supplies than I can comfortably carry back up the mountain. Seems wasteful to let good food go to rot when someone could make use of it." It was a transparent lie, and they both knew it. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, and for a moment Decker thought she would refuse. Then her stomach betrayed her with a low, audible growl that brought color flooding to her pale cheeks. "I cannot pay you," she said quietly. "Did not ask you to." Decker gestured toward the trading post. "I have got salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans. Winter is coming on, and the mice will just get into it if it sits too long." She studied him with those clear eyes, and Decker had the unsettling sensation of being measured and weighed. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she gave a small nod. "You are very kind." "My name is Florence Kensington." Decker Thornton. He touched the brim of his worn hat. "Let me fetch those supplies." As he walked back to where his mule stood patiently waiting, Decker felt the weight of curious stares. He was not known for his sociability or his charity. He kept to himself, traded fairly, and disappeared back into the mountains as quickly as he came. This was decidedly out of character, and he could already imagine the gossip that would spread through Williamsburg's tight-knit community. He did not care. Something about Florence Kensington had reached past all his carefully constructed walls and touched something he had thought long dead. The way she had smiled at that hungry child, the gentle way she had pressed that bread into small hands despite her own desperate need, it spoke of a spirit that poverty and hardship had not broken. Decker loaded a bundle with salt pork, a good-sized bag of cornmeal, dried beans, some coffee, and a few other necessities. It was more than he had intended to give, more than was wise for a man who needed to provision himself for a long mountain winter, but he could hunt and trap to supplement his stores. He doubted Florence had that luxury. When he returned to where she waited, standing straight-backed and dignified despite the obvious weakness in her limbs, her eyes widened at the size of the bundle. "That is too much," she protested. "It is what I can spare." Decker's tone brooked no argument. "Where should I take it?" She hesitated, and he saw shame flicker across her features. "I am staying in a room behind the church. Reverend Patterson has been kind enough to allow me space in exchange for helping his wife with the washing and mending." Decker nodded and fell into step beside her, his long legs easily matching her slower pace. Up close, he could see the careful patches in her dress, the worn-through soles of her boots that had been repaired so many times they were more stitching than leather. Yet she carried herself with a grace that spoke of better days. "You are not from Williamsburg," he observed. "No, I came from Richmond 6 months ago." Her voice was carefully neutral. "After my father passed. No other family, none that would claim me." There was no self-pity in her tone, just a simple statement of fact. They walked in silence for a few moments. Decker was acutely aware of the stares following them, the whispers behind hands. In a small town like Williamsburg, a woman's reputation was everything, and being seen in the company of a rough mountain man would do Florence no favors. Yet she walked beside him with her head high, apparently unconcerned with gossip. The church was a small wooden structure that had been painted white once, but now showed gray weathering. Reverend Patterson, a thin man with kind eyes and thinning gray hair, was sweeping the front steps. He looked up at their approach, his eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of Decker's massive frame beside Florence's slight one. "Miss Kensington," he greeted, then nodded to Decker. "Mr. Thornton, Reverend," Decker returned the nod, "brought some supplies for Miss Kensington." Understanding dawned in the Reverend's eyes, followed by approval. "That is very generous of you. Florence, why do not you show Mr. Thornton where to put those things? I will let my wife know you will be delayed with the washing." Florence led Decker around the side of the church to a small lean-to structure that might charitably be called a shed. Inside was a narrow cot, a battered trunk, a small table with a single chair, and little else. It was clean and tidy, but so sparse it made Decker's mountain cabin look palatial by comparison. He set the bundle of supplies on the table, which groaned under the weight. Florence stood in the doorway, and in the dim light he could see tears shining in her eyes, though she fought to keep them from falling. "I do not know how to thank you," she whispered. "No need." Decker felt awkward in the confined space, too large and rough for such a delicate setting. "Just take care of yourself." "Why did you do this?" The question burst from her as though she could not contain it. "You do not know me. I am nobody." Decker met her gaze, and the words came from somewhere deep inside, a place he usually kept locked tight. "I saw you give your last bread to a hungry child. That is not nobody. That is somebody with more worth than most folks I have met." A tear escaped and tracked down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but more followed. "I am sorry. I do not usually cry. It has just been a very long time since anyone showed me kindness." Without thinking, Decker reached out and gently wiped a tear from her face with his calloused thumb. The gesture was startlingly intimate, and they both froze. Her skin was soft as flower petals beneath his rough hand, and the contact sent something like lightning through his veins. He pulled back as if burned. "I should go. Wait." Florence caught his sleeve. Her hand looked impossibly small against his muscular forearm. "Will you come back?" "Before you return to the mountains." Decker knew he should say no. He should load his mule and head back to the solitude and safety of his cabin. Getting involved with anyone, especially a woman like Florence who made him feel things he had no business feeling, was asking for trouble. "Yes," he heard himself say instead. The smile that bloomed on her face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. It transformed her from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful, and Decker felt that crack in his heart widen a little more. He left before he could do something foolish, striding back through town to the trading post where his mule waited with patient resignation. But instead of loading up and leaving immediately, as was his usual custom, Decker found himself lingering. He checked into the boarding house, something he rarely did, preferring to camp on the outskirts of town. The proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Wilson, nearly dropped her ledger in surprise. "Mr. Thornton, we have not seen you take a room in, 3 years?" "Need to get some business done before I head back," Decker mumbled, paying for 2 nights. In truth, he could not have said what business needed doing. His pelts were traded, his supplies purchased, but he could not leave. Not yet, not without seeing her again. That evening he found himself walking past the church. It was full dark, and lamplight glowed in the windows of the main building. From somewhere behind it, he heard singing. Following the sound, he found Florence hanging washing by moonlight, her voice raised in a hymn that was both mournful and hopeful. She did not notice him at first, and Decker stood in shadow watching her work. The bundle of food he had brought seemed to have restored some of her strength, for her movements were steadier than they had been that afternoon. She sang as she worked, and there was such sweetness in her voice that Decker felt his throat tighten. When she finally saw him, she did not startle or cry out. She simply smiled as if she had been expecting him. "I thought you might come," she said softly. "Cannot seem to help myself." The admission cost him, but it was the truth. Florence set down her basket and walked over to where he stood at the edge of the lamplight. "Would you like to sit? I cannot offer you much, but I made coffee with what you brought." They sat on an old wooden bench near her little room, drinking coffee from chipped cups. Decker could not remember the last time he had sat with another person like this, in companionable silence broken by occasional gentle conversation. Florence did not pry or push, did not ask invasive questions or demand explanations. She simply existed beside him, warm and alive and present in a way that made the loneliness of his mountain existence suddenly feel like a choice rather than a necessity. "Tell me about the mountains," she said eventually. "I have never been higher than the foothills." So Decker told her. He described the way morning mist clung to the valleys, how elk bugled in the fall, the crystalline silence of new snow. He told her about the cabin he had built with his own hands, the garden he tended in the short growing season, the streams so clear you could count pebbles on the bottom from 20 feet away. He spoke of solitude and self-sufficiency, of living by the rhythms of nature rather than the constraints of society. And she listened with such rapt attention, such genuine interest, that Decker found himself sharing things he had never spoken aloud. The death of his parents when he was 17, leaving him alone in the world. His years trying to fit into civilized society, working in mills and factories, suffocating under walls and expectations. The day he had finally walked away from it all, heading into the mountains with nothing but a rifle and the clothes on his back. "Were you not afraid," Florence asked, "to be so alone?" "Less afraid than I was of losing myself in the crowd." Decker stared into his coffee. "Up there, I know who I am. I do not have to pretend or perform, I can just be." "I understand that." Her voice was soft with memory. "After my mother died, my father remarried quickly. His new wife did not want the reminder of his first marriage around. I spent years trying to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible. When father finally passed, I thought perhaps I could find somewhere to just exist without apology. But it is hard when you have nothing." "You have more than you know," Decker said quietly. "That child you fed today has something precious because of you. That is not nothing. The child's name is Samuel. His mother died last winter and his father works at the docks when there is work to be had. There is not much work." Florence's hands wrapped around her cup as if drawing warmth from it. "There are so many people hurting and I have so little to give." "You give what you can. That is more than most." They sat until the coffee grew cold and the moon climbed high. When Decker finally rose to leave, Florence walked him to the edge of the churchyard. "Thank you," she said. "For the food, yes, but also for tonight, for listening, for understanding. Can I see you tomorrow?" The question escaped before Decker could think better of it. Her smile was answer enough, but she said, "I would like that very much." Decker walked back to the boarding house feeling lighter than he had in years, despite the confusion churning in his chest. He was a solitary man by choice and necessity. He had no business courting anyone, let alone a woman as good and gentle as Florence Kensington. He had nothing to offer her but a hard life in the mountains, isolation, and the constant struggle of frontier living. Yet he could not stop thinking about her smile, the sound of her laughter, the way she had looked at him as if he were someone worth knowing. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the bare tree branches. Decker woke early, as was his habit, and found himself at loose ends. He was not accustomed to leisure, to time stretching empty before him. After a quick breakfast at the boarding house, he walked through town, ostensibly checking his gear but really just killing time until a decent hour to call on Florence. He found her at the town well, drawing water. The bucket was clearly too heavy for her slight frame and she struggled to lift it from the hook. Decker was at her side in an instant, his large hands easily hefting the weight. "Let me." Florence jumped, startled, then laughed. "You have a talent for appearing out of nowhere. Old habit. In the mountains, it pays to move quiet." Decker carried the bucket toward the church. "What is all this water for?" "Laundry day. Mrs. Patterson and I do washing for some of the wealthier families in town." She fell into step beside him. "It is hard work, but it pays a little." Decker frowned, thinking of her already thin frame engaged in the back-breaking labor of washing clothes by hand all day. "You should not be doing such heavy work." "I should not starve either," Florence said pragmatically. "We all do what we must." He could not argue with that, though every protective instinct he possessed rebelled against the idea of her wearing herself to the bone. They made 3 more trips to the well together, Decker carrying the heavy buckets while Florence tried to protest that he had better things to do. "Cannot think of a single one," he said honestly. Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman with a kind face and shrewd eyes, emerged from the church as they finished. She took one look at Decker and Florence together and smiled. "Mr. Thornton, how good of you to help Florence." "Young man, you look like you could use a decent breakfast. I have got biscuits and ham if you are interested." It was impossible to refuse such a warm invitation. And soon Decker found himself seated at the Pattersons' modest table, eating excellent biscuits while the Reverend asked him about conditions in the high country and his plans for the winter. "I usually head back before the first big snow," Decker explained. "Once winter sets in proper, the passes become impassable until spring, so you will be leaving soon." Mrs. Patterson glanced meaningfully at Florence, who had gone pink and was studying her plate with intense focus. "In a few days, yes." The words felt heavier than Decker expected. A few days ago, the thought of returning to his cabin had filled him with contentment. Now it felt like exile. After breakfast, Reverend Patterson excused himself to work on his sermon, and Mrs. Patterson tactfully remembered urgent business that required her presence in the church. This left Decker and Florence alone at the table, an awkward silence stretching between them. "I suppose a few days is not very long," Florence said quietly. "No." Decker wanted to reach across the table, take her hand, but he kept his own hands carefully still. "Florence, I need to be honest with you. I do not know what I am doing here. I have not courted anyone since I was a young man, and that ended badly enough that I swore off the whole thing. I have got nothing to offer you but a hard life in the mountains, away from everything civilized and comfortable." "Do I strike you as someone comfortable with civilization?" Florence asked, a hint of sharpness in her tone. "I live in a shed behind a church, Decker. I own 2 dresses and 1 pair of boots held together by thread and prayer. Whatever comfort civilization offers, it has not extended to me." "Fair point." Decker managed a small smile. "But the mountains are different. It is beautiful, yes, but it is also harsh and unforgiving. Winters are brutal. The nearest neighbor is a day's ride away. If something goes wrong, if someone gets sick or hurt, there is no doctor, no help coming. It is just you and the land and whatever strength you can muster." Florence met his gaze steadily. "And you think I am too weak for that life?" "No." The word came out more forcefully than he intended. "No. I think you are one of the strongest people I have ever met. I saw that the moment you gave your last breath away. But strength of spirit and surviving a mountain winter are different things." "Then perhaps you should let me decide what I am capable of." She stood, gathering dishes with sharp, precise movements. "I appreciate your concern, Decker, but I am tired of people deciding what is best for me. My stepmother decided I should be invisible. My father decided I was less important than keeping his new wife happy. The good people of Williamsburg decided I was too poor and too unmarried to be worthy of anything but pity and laundry work. I am done being decided for." Decker stood as well, his chair scraping back. "That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Florence turned to face him, and he saw tears sparkling in her eyes though her voice remained strong. "Did you mean that you care about me but not enough to consider a future? That I am worth kindness but not commitment? Or perhaps that you would rather be alone in your mountains than take a chance on something that might actually bring you happiness?" The accusation hit home because it was true. Decker had been alone so long that solitude had become comfortable, safe. The thought of letting someone in, of caring enough to hurt if something went wrong, terrified him more than any bear or blizzard. "I am scared," he admitted, the words dragged up from somewhere deep. "I am scared of caring about you and letting you down. Of bringing you to the mountains and watching that spirit of yours wither because I cannot give you what you need. I am scared that I have forgotten how to be around people, how to be a good partner to anyone." Florence's expression softened. She crossed to him, looking up into his face with those Summer Creek eyes. "I am scared too. Scared of staying here and slowly disappearing into poverty and exhaustion. Scared of never mattering to anyone. Scared of letting another winter come and go without hope of something better." She reached up, hesitantly touching his bearded jaw. "But I am more scared of letting fear stop me from taking a chance on you. Decker caught her hand, pressing it against his face. Her palm was small and warm, calloused from work but gentle. "I do not know how to do this," he confessed. "Neither do I." Florence smiled through her tears. "Perhaps we could figure it out together." He bent down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When their lips met, it was soft and sweet and tasted like hope. Decker had kissed women before, but nothing had ever felt like this, like coming home after years of wandering. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Decker rested his forehead against hers. "Come with me," he whispered. "To the mountains. I know it is fast, I know it is asking a lot, but come with me." "Yes." Florence did not hesitate. "Yes, I will come with you." The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Reverend Patterson, with his wife's enthusiastic encouragement, agreed to marry them before they left for the mountains. There was no time for a fancy wedding, but Florence did not seem to care. Mrs. Patterson produced a dress that had belonged to her daughter, altered to fit Florence's smaller frame, and declared it perfect. Decker used the time to purchase additional supplies and a gentle mare for Florence to ride. He chose the animal carefully, looking for steady temperament over speed or flash. The mare was a pretty bay with a calm eye and a willingness to stand quiet while he checked her over. "She is beautiful," Florence breathed when he showed her. "But Decker, the expense, my wife needs a good horse." The possessive pronoun sent a thrill through both of them. "Besides, I got a fair price. The owner owed me a favor from some pelts I sold him last year." The wedding took place at sunset on a crisp November evening. The small church was lit with candles, and a handful of townspeople who had grown fond of Florence attended to bear witness. Decker wore his cleanest buckskins and had trimmed his beard, though his long hair still brushed his shoulders. Florence looked ethereal in the altered dress, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders for the first time since Decker had met her. As he watched her walk down the short aisle toward him, Decker felt his throat tighten with emotion. This woman, who had every reason to be bitter and hard, who owned almost nothing and had been failed by nearly everyone who should have cared for her, was choosing to trust him with her future. The weight of that responsibility was staggering, but so was the joy. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor, to care for each other in sickness and health, for richer or poorer. When Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, Decker kissed Florence with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior, cupping her face in his large hands as if she were made of spun glass. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a simple supper, which they shared with the Reverend and the few guests. There was laughter and well wishes, practical advice about mountain living from old Mr. Henderson, who had trapped in his youth, and a few tears from Mrs. Patterson, who had grown attached to Florence. That night, in the room Decker had kept at the boarding house, he held his new wife in his arms and marveled at the turn his life had taken. Florence lay with her head on his chest, her small body tucked against his larger frame, fitting perfectly despite their difference in size. "Are you sure about this?" he asked into the darkness. "There is still time to change your mind." Florence propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with an expression of exasperated fondness. "Decker Thornton, if you ask me that one more time, I swear I will take that mare you bought me and ride to the mountains myself, leaving you to chase after me." He laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "Yes, madam, I am sure." She settled back against him. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I am absolutely certain about something." They left at dawn, when frost still glittered on the ground and their breath steamed in the cold air. Decker had loaded their supplies carefully on the pack mule, distributing weight evenly for the long journey ahead. Florence sat her new mare confidently despite limited riding experience, her back straight and her eyes bright with anticipation rather than fear. The journey into the mountains took 3 days. They followed old hunting trails that wound through increasingly dense forest, climbing steadily as the foothills gave way to true mountain country. Decker watched Florence carefully, ready to slow their pace if she showed signs of fatigue, but she proved tougher than her slight frame suggested. She did not complain when the trail grew rough or when cold rain soaked through their clothes on the second day. At night, they camped under the stars or under a crude lean-to when weather demanded it. Decker taught her how to build a fire that would last the night, how to read the forest sounds to know what moved in the darkness. She learned quickly, asking intelligent questions and applying the answers immediately. On the third evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, they crested a final ridge and Decker pointed down into the valley below. "There. That is home," Florence gasped. The valley was beautiful in the slanting light, a bowl of green surrounded by towering peaks. A stream glinted silver as it wound through the meadow, and near its banks sat a sturdy log cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. "Wait, there is smoke." Florence looked at him questioningly. "Left a slow fire banked when I went down for supplies. Should have kept things from freezing up inside." Decker was pleased with himself for that bit of forethought, though he had not known then that he would be bringing a wife home. They descended into the valley as twilight gathered. Up close, the cabin was even more impressive. Built from logs Decker had cut and chinked himself, it was solid and weathertight with a real glass window, a luxury in this wilderness. Inside, the single room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, still holding the embers of Decker's carefully banked fire. There was a rope bed in one corner piled with furs and blankets, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs that clearly had not been there long, open shelves holding dishes and supplies, and hooks on the walls for clothing and equipment. "You made another chair," Florence observed, running her hand over the smooth wood. "Seemed like I might need one," Decker said, suddenly shy. He had spent his first night as a married man carving that second chair by lamplight, unable to sleep for thinking about the woman who would share his home. Florence turned to him, eyes shining. "Decker, it is wonderful. It is more than I ever hoped for." Relief flooded through him. He had worried she would find it too primitive, too rough. "It is not much, it is ours." She crossed to him, taking his hands. "That makes it everything." The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm as Florence learned the patterns of mountain life. Decker taught her to shoot his rifle, patiently correcting her stance until she could hit a target more often than not. He showed her where the best fishing holes lay, how to set snares for rabbits, which plants were edible and which to avoid. She proved an eager student, soaking up knowledge with the same intensity she brought to everything else. In turn, Florence transformed the cabin from a functional shelter into a home. She made curtains from spare fabric, planted herbs in pots near the window for winter growing, and insisted on a daily routine that brought order to Decker's previously haphazard existence. She was an excellent cook, able to make even simple ingredients into something special, and her laughter filled the cabin with warmth no fire could match. But it was the quiet moments Decker treasured most. Evenings spent before the fire, Florence sewing while he repaired equipment, comfortable silence broken by easy conversation. Mornings waking to find her curled against him, her breathing soft and even. The way she smiled when he returned from checking his trap lines, as if his presence was a gift she had not expected. Winter arrived in earnest in early December, bringing snow that transformed the valley into something from a fairy tale. Florence stood at the cabin door, eyes wide with wonder as fat flakes drifted down from a gray sky. "I have never seen so much snow," she breathed. "This is just the start." Decker came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "By January, it will be up to your waist in places. Will we be snowed in? For stretches, yes. But I have got trails I keep clear to the woodpile, the stream, and the smokehouse. We will not starve or freeze." He tightened his embrace. "Are you scared?" "No." Florence leaned back against his broad chest. "I have never felt safer in my life." The first real test of her resolve came 3 weeks later. Decker had gone out to check the trap lines, a routine journey that should have taken half a day. But an unexpected snowstorm blew in, reducing visibility to nearly nothing. By the time he made it back to the cabin, he was ice-crusted and shaking with cold despite his heavy furs. Florence took one look at him and sprang into action. She got him out of his frozen clothes, wrapped him in every blanket they owned, and set him by the fire. Then she made hot broth and forced him to drink it while she checked his fingers and toes for frostbite. "You could have died out there," she said, her voice shaking. "But I did not." Decker caught her hands. "I have been doing this for years, Florence. I know how to survive." "Survival is not the same as living." She blinked back tears. "Promise me you will be more careful. Promise me you will not take unnecessary risks." "Because if something happened to you, if I lost you—" Her voice broke. Decker pulled her into his arms, blankets and all. "I promise. I have got too much to lose now." After that, they established new rules. Decker would not go far from the cabin when storms threatened. He taught Florence the signs to watch for, how to read the weather in the behavior of animals and the feel of the air. She made him promise to always tell her where he was going and when to expect him back. In return, Florence pushed herself to become more self-sufficient. She practiced with the rifle until she could reliably hit targets at 50 yards. She learned to navigate by landmarks so she would not get lost if she had to venture out in Decker's absence. She studied the trail markers he had established, committing them to memory. Christmas came, and they celebrated simply but joyfully. Decker had trapped a turkey, which Florence roasted to perfection. He carved her a set of wooden spoons as a gift, each one smoothed to satin softness by his patient hands. She presented him with a shirt she had sewn from fabric she had brought from Williamsburg, every stitch perfect. "I love you," she said as he tried it on, marveling at how perfectly it fit across his broad shoulders. "I know we have not said it yet, but I do. I love you, Decker Thornton." "I love you too." The words came easily because they were true. "Have since I saw you give that bread away. Maybe even before that, in some way I did not recognize. You captured my soul, Florence. I did not even know I had one anymore until you showed me." They made love that night with a passion and tenderness that left them both breathless, the firelight painting their skin in gold and shadow. Afterward, tangled together under the furs, Florence traced the scars on Decker's chest with gentle fingers. "Tell me about these," she requested softly. So he did. He told her about the bear that had nearly killed him 5 years ago, showing her the claw marks that raked across his ribs, the burned scar on his shoulder from a campfire accident, the puckered mark on his thigh from an arrow during a conflict with raiders who had tried to steal his furs. In turn, she showed him her own scars, the mark on her wrist from her stepmother's switch, the small burn on her palm from a cooking accident when she was a child and no one had taught her proper safety. Each mark was a story, a piece of their pasts that had shaped who they had become. "We are quite a pair," Florence said with a soft laugh, "both of us scarred and battered by life. Maybe that is why we fit." Decker kissed her forehead. "We understand what it is to survive, to keep going when it would be easier to quit." January brought the deepest cold, temperatures that made the air hurt to breathe and turned water to ice in minutes. They stayed close to the cabin during the worst of it, venturing out only for essential tasks. Decker had stocked plenty of wood, and they kept the fire roaring day and night. It was during this time of enforced closeness that they really got to know each other. Florence told him about her childhood, her gentle mother who had died when she was 12, her father who had loved her but not enough to stand up to his new wife. She spoke of her dreams of making a difference, of helping people, of mattering. "You matter to me," Decker told her, "more than anything, I know. But I want to matter in a larger sense too. I want my life to mean something beyond just surviving." She looked at him earnestly. "Do you understand?" He did. It was part of why he had retreated to the mountains, searching for a life of purpose rather than the meaningless grind of factory work. "What would you want to do? Up here, I mean. There are not exactly crowds of people needing help." Florence was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I have been thinking about that. In spring, when the passes open, travelers will start coming through again. Trappers, traders, maybe families heading west. We are positioned right on one of the main routes through the mountains." "We are," Decker confirmed, wondering where she was going with this. "What if we offered a place for them to stop? Not an inn exactly, but a way station. Somewhere people could rest, get a hot meal, resupply. We have space in the valley for another building or two. You could hire on to guide people through the difficult passes. I could tend to anyone who needs medical help, cook, provide comfort to weary travelers." Her eyes were bright with possibility. "We could make a real difference, Decker. Help people who are struggling just like we both struggled." It was a good idea, actually. More than good. Travelers through the mountains often arrived desperate and exhausted, easy prey for the harsh environment and human predators alike. A safe way station run by people who actually cared could save lives. "You have been planning this for a while," Decker observed, "since Christmas." Florence bit her lip. "Are you angry? I should have asked before making plans." "I am not angry, I am impressed." Decker pulled her close. "It is a fine idea. We would need to build at least one more structure before next fall. I can harvest timber this spring when the snow melts. But Florence, it would be a lot of work." "I am not afraid of work," she smiled. "And I would not be alone. I would have you, always." He kissed her. "You will always have me." When February arrived, the worst of the winter was behind them. The days grew incrementally longer, and though snow still fell regularly, it lacked the brutal intensity of the deep winter months. Decker began venturing further from the cabin, checking on his extended trap lines and scouting the best timber for the building project they had planned. Florence came with him when weather permitted, growing stronger and more confident in the wilderness with each passing day. She learned to read tracks, identifying deer, elk, rabbit, and the occasional mountain lion. Decker taught her the rhythms of the forest, the way everything connected in an intricate web of life and death. One afternoon in late February, they were returning from checking the northern trap line when Florence suddenly grabbed Decker's arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing. At the edge of the clearing stood a massive elk, its antlers spread like a crown. It regarded them calmly, showing no fear, steam rising from its nostrils in the cold air. For a long moment, all three stood frozen. Then the elk tossed its head and bounded away into the forest. "That was magnificent," Florence breathed. "First one you have seen up close." Decker was pleased. He wanted her to experience all the beauty the mountains had to offer, not just the hardship. "Everything here is so alive," she said as they continued toward the cabin. "Even in winter, even in the harshest conditions, life finds a way. It is humbling." That night, as they lay in bed, Florence took Decker's hand and placed it on her stomach. "Speaking of life finding a way," she said softly, "I think we are going to have a baby." Decker froze, his mind struggling to process the words. "A baby, you are certain?" As certain as I can be without a doctor to confirm it. I am about 6 weeks late and I have been feeling ill in the mornings." She watched his face anxiously. "Are you happy? I know we have not talked about children yet, and with the waystation plans, happy does not begin to cover it." Decker pulled her into his arms, careful to be gentle. "Florence, this is the best news you could have given me. A child, our child." Wonder filled his voice. She relaxed against him. "I was worried you might think it was too soon. Maybe it is by conventional standards. But we have never been conventional." He stroked her hair. "When do you think the baby will come, if my calculations are right, sometime in October?" Florence yawned. "We have time to prepare, and Decker, I am not fragile. I can still help with the building and the preparations. Within reason." His protective instincts were already roaring to life. No heavy lifting, no unnecessary risks. Yes, husband. But she smiled as she said it, knowing his concern came from love. March brought the first true signs of spring. Ice began to break up on the stream, and the snow receded from the lower elevations. Decker started felling trees for the new building, choosing sturdy pines and working from dawn until dusk while the weather held. Florence helped when she could, stripping branches and preparing the logs, but Decker was careful to keep her away from the most dangerous work. They had their first visitors in early April, a group of trappers heading north to take advantage of the spring season. Decker knew 2 of them from previous encounters, and they were happy to camp near the cabin and share news from the lower settlements. Florence was in her element, cooking for the group and listening to their stories. The trappers were initially wary of her, unused to seeing women in the high country, but her genuine warmth and excellent cooking quickly won them over. "Your husband is a lucky man," one of them told her. "Not many women could handle this life." "I think I am the lucky one," Florence replied, glancing at Decker, who was deep in conversation about the best routes through the northern passes. When the trappers left 2 days later, they carried with them stories of the Thorntons' hospitality and the promise to spread word that a waystation was being established in the valley. It was a good start. Through the spring and into summer, Decker worked tirelessly on the new building. It would serve multiple purposes: a common room where travelers could gather and eat, a small infirmary area where Florence could tend to the sick or injured, and 2 small sleeping rooms for those who needed shelter. Other trappers and travelers stopped by as word spread, often lending a hand with the construction in exchange for a hot meal and a safe place to camp. The mountain community was small and scattered, but there was a code of mutual aid among those who chose this hard life. Help given was help that might be returned when you needed it most. Florence bloomed as her pregnancy progressed. By midsummer, her condition was obvious, and she moved with the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo. But she remained active, planting a larger garden, tending to travelers who stopped by, and helping Decker with lighter construction tasks. In July, a family arrived in desperate condition. The father had broken his leg fording a river, and the mother was exhausted from trying to manage their 2 young children while supporting her injured husband. They had been making for a settlement on the western side of the mountains, but would never make it with the father unable to walk. Florence settled them in the new building, which was nearly complete, and set the man's leg as best she could with Decker's help. She fed the family, comforted the frightened children, and gave the exhausted mother a chance to rest. The family stayed for 3 weeks while the father healed, and when they finally departed, the father pressed coins into Decker's hand despite his protests. "You saved us," the man said simply. "Let us pay what we can." It was the first money the waystation had earned, and though Decker tried to refuse it, Florence quietly accepted it. "We will need supplies we cannot make ourselves," she reminded him. Medicine, cloth, things for the baby. This is not charity, Decker. It is fair payment for fair service. She was right, as she often was. Decker was still adjusting to the idea that they were no longer just a man and woman surviving in the wilderness, but the keepers of a waystation, providers of help to those who needed it. August brought more travelers, and the waystation building was completed just in time. Decker built sturdy bunks, and Florence sewed mattresses stuffed with pine needles and whatever soft materials they could gather. It was not luxurious, but it was clean, safe, and warm. For people who had been sleeping on the ground for weeks, it was paradise. Florence proved to have a gift for making people feel welcome. She learned names and stories, offered comfort to the homesick, and had a way of drawing out even the most taciturn travelers. Decker watched her work with quiet pride, marveling at how she seemed to grow more beautiful and more vital with each passing day. In September, with Florence's belly round and prominent and the baby's arrival imminent, they made a decision. Decker rode down to the nearest settlement, 2 days' journey away, and returned with a midwife named Hannah, a capable woman in her 50s who had delivered half the babies in the territory. "Heard you were doing good work up here," Hannah said as she settled into the waystation. "Figured you could use experienced hands when the little one comes." She stayed through September and into October, helping Florence prepare and making herself useful around the waystation. Decker was grateful for her presence, knowing his skills did not extend to childbirth, and terrified something would go wrong. The baby came on a crisp October morning, arriving with the dawn. Florence's labor was hard but mercifully brief, and when Hannah placed the squalling infant in her arms, both parents wept with joy. "A son," Hannah announced, "healthy and strong with a good set of lungs." Decker held his son for the first time with trembling hands, awed by the tiny perfect fingers and the shock of dark hair. "He is beautiful," he whispered. "He looks like you," Florence said tiredly from the bed, but she was smiling. They named him Daniel, and he became the heart of their small family. Decker, who had spent years alone and hardened by solitude, discovered reserves of gentleness he had not known he possessed. He would sit for hours holding his sleeping son, marveling at the miracle of this new life. Florence recovered her strength quickly, and soon the waystation was operating normally again with Daniel sleeping in a cradle Decker had carved near wherever his mother worked. Travelers cooed over the baby, and his presence seemed to make the waystation feel even more like home. That winter was easier than the previous one, despite the added responsibility of a baby. They had established routines, their teamwork was seamless, and the waystation provided both purpose and occasional company. Daniel thrived, growing fat and happy on his mother's milk, and his laughter became the soundtrack of their days. Spring brought renewed activity as the passes cleared. Word of the Thornton waystation had spread throughout the territory, and a steady stream of travelers arrived seeking rest and provisions. Some stayed only a night, others lingered for days or weeks, helping with projects in exchange for board. Florence had transformed the waystation into more than just a place to sleep. She had created a community hub where news was shared, friendships formed, and the isolated mountain folk could connect with the wider world. Decker hired on occasionally as a guide, leading travelers through the most treacherous passes, always returning home to Florence and Daniel. When Daniel took his first steps in the summer of 1874, a group of trappers who had stopped by cheered as enthusiastically as his parents. When he spoke his first word that fall, "Da," to Decker's endless delight, Florence recorded it carefully in the journal she had started keeping of their life. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. A second child, a daughter they named Grace, arrived in the spring of 1876. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady temperament, and Daniel adored his little sister with protective fervor that reminded Florence of Decker. The waystation continued to grow. They added a small stable for travelers' horses, expanded the garden, and built a smoke house for preserving meat. Decker taught Daniel to trap and hunt as the boy grew, passing on the skills that had kept him alive in the wilderness. Florence taught both children to read and write, using books travelers sometimes left behind or brought as gifts. In 1878, a particularly harsh winter brought tragedy to the mountains. A group of travelers caught in an unexpected blizzard stumbled into the waystation half frozen and desperate. Florence and Decker worked through the night to save them, and while they managed to pull most of the group back from the brink, one man died despite their best efforts. It hit Florence hard. She had poured everything into trying to save him, and his death felt like a personal failure. "You cannot save everyone," Decker told her as she wept in his arms that night. "You can only do your best and trust that it is enough." "Is it enough?" Florence looked up at him with reddened eyes. "When people still die, you saved 4 lives tonight. 4 people who would have frozen to death if not for you, for this waystation, for your generous heart." Decker cupped her face gently. "That man who died, he got to spend his last hours warm and comfortable, not alone in the snow. That is a gift too, Florence. Not the one we wanted to give him, but a gift nonetheless." She cried herself out against his chest, and in the morning rose with renewed determination. The death had shaken her but not broken her spirit, and if anything, she became even more dedicated to the waystation's mission. By 1880, the waystation was a recognized landmark in the territory. Daniel, now 7, was becoming a capable young helper, able to handle horses and assist with basic tasks. Grace, at 4, was a cheerful presence who seemed to brighten everyone's day. A third child, a son named Thomas, had arrived that spring, completing their family. Decker, now 40 years old, had aged well. His hair was streaked with gray, and lines had deepened around his eyes, but he was still powerfully built and more content than he had ever imagined possible. The solitary mountain man who had once thought himself destined for a life alone, now found himself surrounded by love and purpose. Florence, 32 and still beautiful despite the marks of hard work and childbearing, had become a pillar of the mountain community. People traveled out of their way to stop at the Thornton waystation, knowing they would find not just shelter but genuine care. One evening in late summer, with the children asleep and the waystation quiet, Decker and Florence sat outside watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Decker asked. "Leaving Williamsburg, coming up here, all of it?" Florence laughed softly. "Not for a single moment do you, bringing you up here. No, it was the best decision I ever made." He took her hand, his large calloused one engulfing her smaller one. "But sometimes I wonder if you would have been happier with an easier life, if I could have given you more. Decker Thornton, you gave me everything that matters." Florence turned to face him. "You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You valued my spirit when I had nothing else to offer. You built a life with me where I could matter, where I could help people, where I could be myself without apology." She squeezed his hand. "You gave me love, children, purpose, and a home. What more could I possibly want?" "I saw you give your last bread away," Decker said softly, remembering that day in Williamsburg that had changed everything. "Your generous spirit, even when you had nothing, it captured my soul completely. I did not even know I had a soul left to capture until that moment." "And I saw a rough mountain man with the kindest eyes I had ever encountered," Florence replied. "A man who saw my hunger and fed it, who saw my loneliness and offered companionship, who saw my dreams and helped me build them into reality." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars wheel overhead. From inside the cabin came the soft sounds of sleeping children. In the waystation building, a family of travelers who had arrived that afternoon rested safely. The valley was peaceful, wrapped in the gentle embrace of a summer night. Decker thought back to the man he had been 8 years ago, hard and closed off, convinced that solitude was the only life for him. He had been surviving but not truly living. Then Florence had walked into his life with her gentle spirit and her fierce determination, and everything had changed. "I love you," he said, words that came easily now after years of practice. "More than I did yesterday, less than I will tomorrow." Florence smiled, recognizing the phrase he had started using after Daniel was born. "I love you too, always and forever." The years continued to roll forward, bringing the challenges and changes that mark any life. The children grew, the waystation prospered, and the Thorntons became legendary figures in the mountain territories. Stories spread of their kindness, their willingness to help anyone in need, and the safe haven they had created in the wilderness. Daniel grew into a young man much like his father, strong and capable with a quiet confidence that drew people to him. He chose to stay in the mountains, eventually building his own cabin in a neighboring valley and establishing his own trap lines while remaining close enough to help with the waystation. Grace inherited her mother's compassionate nature and learned everything Florence could teach her about healing and helping others. She eventually married a doctor who had stopped at the waystation, and together they established a proper medical practice in the growing settlement 2 valleys over. Thomas, the youngest, had his own path to forge. He became a guide like his father, leading travelers through the treacherous mountain passes with skill and reliability that made him sought after throughout the territory. As Decker and Florence aged, they gradually turned over more of the waystation's operation to younger hands, though they never truly retired. Even in their 60s and 70s, they could be found welcoming travelers, sharing stories by the fire, and offering the same generous hospitality that had always been the waystation's hallmark. On a crisp autumn morning in 1895, Decker and Florence sat on the porch of their cabin, much as they had done countless times over the years. They were older now, their hair white, their movements slower, but their love had only deepened with time. 23 years, Florence said, looking out over the valley they had made their own. "Since that day in Williamsburg when you saw me give away bread." "Best day of my life," Decker replied. "Well, until the next day when I married you, and the day Daniel was born, and Grace, and Thomas." He chuckled. "Seems like you have given me a lot of best days. We gave them to each other." Florence leaned against his shoulder. "Do you remember how scared we both were? How uncertain? I remember thinking I had no business asking you to come to the mountains with me. Thought I had nothing to offer you but hardship. Instead, you gave me everything." Florence took his weathered hand in hers. "A home, a family, a purpose. You let me be the person I was meant to be." From the waystation came the sound of laughter. Their granddaughter, Daniel's daughter Margaret, was serving breakfast to a group of travelers who had arrived late the previous evening. The waystation was in good hands. The legacy they had built would continue long after they were gone. No regrets. Decker asked, the question he had posed so many times over the years. "Not a single one." Florence kissed his cheek. "You captured my soul just as much as I captured yours. We saved each other, Decker." He pulled her close, marveling as he always did that this woman had chosen him, had seen past his rough exterior to the lonely man beneath, and had loved him anyway. "Best decision I ever made was talking to you that day." Best decision I ever made was saying yes when you asked me to come with you." Florence settled against him, comfortable and content. "Look at what we built, not just the way station, but a family, a community, a life of meaning." The sun climbed higher, warming the valley. In the distance, a hawk cried out as it circled on thermal currents. The stream that ran past the cabin babbled over stones worn smooth by time. Everything was as it should be. That afternoon, they walked down to the way station together, moving slowly but still steady. Margaret greeted them with warm hugs, and they spent time talking with the travelers, sharing stories and advice as they had done for decades. One young woman, traveling west with her husband, reminded Florence so strongly of herself at that age that it brought tears to her eyes. The woman was thin, her clothes worn, but she had helped Margaret serve breakfast with such grace and willingness that Florence recognized a kindred spirit. "Where are you headed?" Florence asked gently. "Oregon. My husband has family there who can help us get started." The woman hesitated. "We do not have much to pay for our stay. Your help this morning was payment enough," Florence interrupted. "Stay as long as you need to rest and prepare for the next leg of your journey." The gratitude in the young woman's eyes was achingly familiar. Florence saw herself in that look, remembered what it felt like to be shown unexpected kindness when you had nothing. Later, as the sun set and they walked back to their cabin, Decker said, "You saw yourself in her." "Yes," Florence did not deny it. "I was her once. Desperate and trying so hard to maintain dignity despite having nothing. And now you get to be the person who helps." Decker squeezed her hand. "The person who shows kindness when it is needed most. That generous spirit of yours, the one that captured my soul all those years ago, it is still changing lives." Florence stopped, turning to look up at her husband. Even in old age, he was handsome to her, his strength now tempered by wisdom and deep kindness. "We have had a good life. The best." Decker kissed her forehead. "And it is not over yet." They continued on, the old mountain man and his wife, walking hand in hand as the stars began to emerge. Behind them, the way station glowed with warm light, a beacon of hope and hospitality in the wilderness. Around them, the mountains stood eternal, witnesses to a love story that had begun with a simple act of kindness and had blossomed into something extraordinary. In the years that followed, Decker and Florence remained active in the way station until their final days. They died within months of each other in the winter of 1898, having lived to see their children grown and prosperous, their grandchildren thriving, and the way station they had built become a permanent institution in the mountain territories. Their legacy lived on not just in the buildings they had constructed or the family they had raised, but in the countless lives they had touched with their kindness and generosity. The way station continued to operate for decades, passed down through the family, always maintaining the spirit of hospitality and care that Decker and Florence had established. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the light slants golden across the valley, travelers at the way station swear they can see two figures walking hand in hand near the old cabin, the mountain man and his wife still together, still in love, still watching over the place they had built from nothing but determination and a generous spirit that had captured two souls and bound them together forever.